Uber, Brighton and Hove, broken promises. There is a very good book written by Stephen Hawking called A Brief History of Time, which is a very complex, in-depth look at how the world was created going back millions of years. There is no proof of the contents, but in regards to Uber in Brighton and Hove, we only have to go back 2 years to get the whole truth. So here is a snippet of A Brief History of Time with regards to Uber in Brighton and Hove and wheelchair accessibility. In October 2015, there was a special panel meeting for the initial Uber application for a Brighton and Hove operator's license. This was a public meeting where the trade were able to ask questions about how Uber works directly to Uber itself. From that public meeting, Uber were granted a 1-year license as opposed to the standard 5-year license, which is like putting Uber on probation to see how it behaves. But it didn't launch until just before the expiry date, so when that first renewal came, there was no reason not to renew it. So a further 1-year license was granted instead of the standard 5-year one, so Uber was put on probation once again. The trade has now called for the 2017 renewal to be held in public again because Uber has now been operating for 12 months whilst holding a license for 24 months, and a petition was raised supporting this with over 1,000 supporters. This petition was presented to the council at the Hove Town Hall and handed over to local councillors who also supported this. And there were over 100 cabs outside Hove Town Hall which had a lot of media coverage.
So several months ago I asked the licensing authority whether they would hold the Uber renewal process in public, and the answer was no. So this petition that the taxi trade have presented this morning I'm glad to receive and pass on to the council with colleagues, because we would like to have this hearing done in an open and transparent manner.
However, the council have refused this based on the point that no other Brighton Hove operator is treated this way. The argument back is that no other operator has acted like Uber, details of which I won't go into here, but there are other videos available on my YouTube channel. So now, 2 years later, the trade would like to have the opportunity again to question Uber on matters that arose from that 2015 public meeting. One of these matters refers to Uber's broken promise that it will only use Brighton Hove licensed cars, whereas in reality it flooded the city with TfL minicabs and private hire cars from places like Sefton, Wolverhampton, Leeds, Portsmouth, Southampton, Reigate and so on, with lots of them sleeping in their cars. However, the purpose of this video is the important issue of Uber not supplying wheelchair accessible vehicles that it undertook to address at that public meeting in 2015, when it was first asking for a Brighton Hove operator's license. Now, the 3 major companies in the city have worked extensively with the council over the years to ensure that proper provision is available to supply wheelchair accessible vehicles upon demand. This ensures that wheelchair users are not discriminated against and they run mixed fleets to cater for everyone. So this brings us to the reason, finally, for producing this video. I recorded the audio of that 2015 public meeting, which was around about 3 hours long because I wanted to have the opportunity to archive what Uber was saying to gain a Brighton and Hove operator's license. The question of wheelchair accessible vehicles was put to Uber, and this is what was stated.
It's just a slightly general observation, is that one of the key things that the UK has different licensing requirements, different regimes, and so Uber obviously accords whichever with the licensing regime, depending on the different city. So, and I think part of what we were trying to get at to in a discussion of the grace period earlier is that if I can delve back into that.
Yeah. Yes, well, let's assume I've asked you a question about that, because I would have done. Yes, grace period and deferral is.
And I think it relates to some of the requirements on drivers as well. The difference is that Uber obviously doesn't operate in Brighton at the moment, and compared to Streamline Cars, for instance, we don't have a number of drivers. We can provide that are wheelchair accessible because we don't have any cars or drivers, and we don't operate yet in Brighton. Mm-hmm. What I think Matthew was trying to get at was the idea that there is a difference between what Uber is now, that is in Brighton, which is just an office and an application, and what we will be when we launch. Because by the time we launch, we will have cars. And a question that, like, how many wheelchair accessible cars you have on the platform, that would be a legitimate question when we have drivers, but we don't have any drivers.
So will we be able as council to come and have a site visit?
So Uber has had the benefit of a 2-year grace period and yet has not provided any wheelchair accessible vehicles. And yes, it is definitely a legitimate question for the council to ask Uber as to where are all those Uber wheelchair accessible vehicles 2 years down the line. However, as I am secretary of the G&B Brighton Hove taxi section, I have made a point of including this in my submission documents to the council, just in case it forgets to ask. Now, let's remind ourselves of what Uber is claimed to be worth. Yes, $69 billion as far as Bloomberg is concerned, and yet it cannot provide any wheelchair accessible vehicles in Brighton Hove, and it's totally ignored this basic responsibility of a private hire operator, which in fact Fred Jones finally admitted it was at a recent trade forum meeting. So, is it really an even playing field for Uber to fully expect the other taxi companies in the city to be the only providers of wheelchair accessible vehicles? Well, silly question, because obviously it does. And of course it must be far easier to run a pseudo private hire operation without accepting the full responsibility to those citizens who rely on wheelchair accessible vehicles. However, of course, with Uber subsidising the true cost of fares via their investors' money, their goal is for world domination, and it has intentions to wipe out all the local and established taxi companies, which will then mean there will not be any wheelchair accessible vehicles available, because it is plain to see that Uber does not care one hoot about providing these special cars. Ironically, with Uber flooding Brighton Hove with hundreds of private hire cars that are not licensed by the council from all over the UK, that are predominantly working here, and with access to thousands of cars, it still cannot give a monkey's whatsit about disabled access. So let's return to that 2015 meeting to hear some more of what was said.
On the disability aspect first, because a lot of has been spoken about that. Does your app give provision for wheelchair accessibility vehicles currently, or any disability? Because obviously there are other disabilities that need certain kinds of vehicles. And if it doesn't, are you planning on doing this?
So in London, we do offer essentially wheelchair accessible vehicles, because we do have black taxi cabs on the platform in London, of which all of them offer wheelchair capabilities. In Brighton, obviously we haven't launched, so it's not something we have made a sort of decision on. But what we want to do in our markets is basically, we do want to offer it, but what we found is we need to get to a certain sort of size where we can reliably offer that product or service. So, for example, I think a lot of our American cities offer Uber WAV, wheelchair accessible vehicle, as standard. I think that's something we definitely want to do across the UK. But as you see, we're very young in a lot of these markets. We're still growing. I don't feel we're at a stage where we can reliably offer that product.
Okay. As an authority, we have, as we mentioned, we have done a lot of work around wheelchair accessible vehicles, and I appreciate that if you get your licence, it will be, you will be building up very gradually. But can you give us an example, maybe another authority other than London, because obviously they're very large. I'm looking at some kind of time scales about, or you've done any market research about how long you feel it might be before you can do that within Brighton and Hove.
Yeah, so one of the biggest barriers is basically having vehicles in the market that are wheelchair accessible vehicles. So, for example, if I look at Manchester, in Manchester, of the private hire vehicles there, almost, I think there's a handful that are wheelchair accessible vehicles. Because we don't employ the drivers and we don't own the vehicles, that means we need people in the market who have those vehicles to essentially buying more before those come into the market. So that's one of the reasons, is in some markets it's just not available. For example, though, it sounds in Brighton that there are significant numbers of wheelchair accessible vehicles, which is fantastic. And therefore, if there is a market where there's already a sizable number of those vehicles, it makes it much easier for us to launch and offer that product, if you see what I mean.
And 2 years down the line, you still do not provide wheelchair accessible vehicles in Brighton Hove. And 2 years down the line, I am reminded of the typical Uber speak that we had to endure throughout those 3 hours of that 2015 public meeting. As a private hire operator, Uber, you have the responsibility as a transport provider to cater for disabilities just the same as the major companies in Brighton Hove have done for many years. Also, you have brought in hundreds of private hire cars from all over the UK that predominantly work in the city. But even though you have access to thousands of Uber private hire cars, to date, you have not bothered to provide any type of wheelchair accessible vehicle service in the city. However, recently, Uber Assist has appeared on the Uber app. But Uber Assist is never available in Brighton Hove, and rest assured, I have tested this many times during the day and night over several weeks, and it always states no assist available. In any case, does Uber Assist provide wheelchair accessible vehicles? And finally, Uber boasts about being an innovative technology company and is worth billions, yet it cannot offer any wheelchair accessible vehicles in Brighton Hove, either on demand or pre-booked in advance. The Uber Brighton Hove operator's licence is now up for renewal in the city, as the current one expires in November 2017. I really hope that Brighton Hove Council takes Uber to task for failing to provide wheelchair accessible vehicles in the city, because if it does not, then it can't have any respect for the many years that the local trade has strived to provide transportation for everyone's need in the city. And just as a reminder, this is what Uber stated in 2015.
By the time we launch, we will have cars, and a question that, like, how many wheelchair accessible cars you have on the platform, that would be a legitimate question when we have drivers, 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 be a legitimate question when we have drivers.